Well, initially, I was working as the Merseyside-based reporter for the Press Association. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Press Association is basically Britain's national wire service. So that means that you provide news stories to a host of national, international and local and regional papers around the country. So if a national story happens in Liverpool and, for instance, the Newcastle newspaper wants a copy on it, they will take it from the Press Association. Because of that, you are often given access as one of a small group called a pool of reporters, on the understanding that you will share the information you get with all the other news outlets that aren't able to have a seat in the event. And that meant that, for instance, I was one of the few reporters who sat in the Magistrates' Court for the first court appearance, and it also put me in Preston Crown Court in the main room, the actual courtroom for that. There was a big overspill room, and they did a live link to that for most of the press, but I was actually in the courtroom itself. And also, and particularly unhappily, I found myself in the small group of journalists who were allowed in for James's funeral as well.
Now, going to the courtroom, you obviously saw Thompson and Venables then, way before anybody else did, when they were led in. How did they look on that particular day?
It was one of those moments I'll never forget as long as I live. I don't know what I expected, but given what they'd done, I certainly didn't expect two very ordinary, unremarkable-looking little kids to walk into the room, and that's what happened. They were just very nondescript, very ordinary, slightly bewildered-looking. I hate to use the word innocent in the context of what they'd done, but they looked like any innocent 10-year-old kids. I could totally understand why so many people had walked past as James was being abducted without thinking anything was untoward, because it was two little boys that you would walk past on a street and not give a second glance to.
We're still talking about this case now because it's been 20 years. Did it change the nation?
I think it certainly had an impact on the national psyche for a time. I think it certainly made me take a long, hard look at the innocence of childhood and just wonder what children are actually capable of. I used the word innocence before. I think there is a general assumption that children are innocent. Having seen those two boys in that courtroom and then having to focus on what they actually did and the enormity of the crime and the sheer horror of the crime that they committed and the pitiless cruelty of it, it's really quite difficult then to look at any other child in quite the same context and not think to yourself, just what is that child capable of? So I think it did make people think twice about that, and it also made people feel more protective towards their children as well. And certainly, there was a sudden mad rush, not just in Merseyside but around the country, on those child harnesses so that children can't wander off when you're at the shops. And people, for a time, I think, were ultra protective of their children in the light of that. I was the first journalist who did interview them. I got to do a book on the Bulger case, and the only exposure they'd had to the media up until that point was the initial press conference when James was still missing, and they made their appeal for help to find him when Denise was obviously so distraught, as was Ralph. I got to meet them with other members of their family. I was sort of introduced to them and then went to interview them, and it was hard for them. These were very ordinary, a nice ordinary couple from Kirby who had never gone through anything like the sort of horrendous experience that had just befallen them before, who has, and then to suddenly, on top of that, have to deal with the pressure of being interviewed by journalists. It was clearly intimidating for them. I think Denise today has become used to being interviewed by the media and is a lot more accomplished and a lot more calm and able to cope. But those early interviews that I did with the two of them, it was a very slow and painstaking process, and I had to set rules where I said, look, we'll start the second you feel you can't go on with this, let's stop and we'll come back to it another time. And that's what we did. We took it very gently and very slowly, and I interviewed them several times over many days before we sort of got through the full story. And when you think of the ground we were covering with those interviews, it was taking them back through absolutely horrendous events in their lives. In some ways, I'd like to think some of it was a little bit cathartic for them, because I was asking questions because I had to, that no one had to ask them before, and they had to sit down and relive moments that they perhaps tried to shut out and deal with them. But it was a difficult enough process for me, and I'm sure it was a horrible process for them. But they were very brave about it and very patient with me.